Hello and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwald. Cormac McCarthy is one of our most important contemporary American authors, and critics often point to his bleak stories and the violence in his narratives and characterize him and his fiction as nihilistic. My guests today, Dr. Rick Elmore and Dr. Jonathan Elmore, are experts on McCarthy, and they find something else in McCarthy's work, something perhaps unexpected, something like hope. Welcome, Rick and John. If I may, John?
Please.
Okay, thank you for coming today.
Thanks for having us.
I want to start just by introducing the two of you because you're both ASU alums, and we're proud of you. And since then, you've gone on to earn PhDs in your respective fields. And something else, you're twins.
It's true.
And you work together quite productively. So I'd like to hear how you got interested in Cormac McCarthy. You a philosopher and you a student of literature and English, and then how you came to work together on articles and ultimately a book about McCarthy.
Well, yeah, when we both had been fans of McCarthy for quite a while, and I actually had read some of his work, particularly All the Pretty Horses and Blood Meridian and The Road in grad school as I was getting that PhD in literary studies. And you've just always been a big reader and had read various things. And after grad school, when we had a little more control over what we were allowed to write, we thought it'd be fun to write together. And we actually started with a different piece, kind of a pop scholarship thing that was fun. And then we both had recently read No Country for Old Men, and we thought, well, this is great. We love this book. Let's write something up on it together.
Yeah.
And that was the first one.
Yeah. And that one, it was somewhat different from our, it wasn't, a planned project that we would write on. Now we've done 8 of his 10 novels, written articles on them. But it was just kind of started out as this, we both enjoy this book. There's themes that seem to overlap. I was thinking about neoliberalism a lot right then, and sort of the politics of neoliberalism, and there's a lot of those themes in that book. But then after we did that, we thought, oh, let's do a piece on the road. And then it sort of, once we did that, we were like, let's just keep going.
Yeah. Well, and I think it was really in the road piece that we began to get a sense that there's an overarching project here in McCarthy's writings as a whole that we're really interested in.
And you're ultimately going to put these essays and articles together in a book. Is that the goal? Is it?
Well, I think the book will be a lot of new material, but some of this might find its way in. But yes.
Yeah, so you're a philosopher, Rick, and you're coming from literary studies, but yet you find common ground. How does that work? Do you start from one field to the other and move to the other field, or?
Well, in certain ways, the fields really aren't that different. I mean, these are fields that are very much about textual analysis and the kinds of humanistic concerns and questions that, well, the humanities have been studying for thousands of years in some cases. So, in a way, they're not all that different in certain ways. Now, well, you might want to talk about some of the differences.
Yeah, I mean, I think the canon is very different. The other thing is, I think this works partly because McCarthy is such a philosophical writer. I mean, there are no accidents in McCarthy's work, and he's so when you find something, you're like, why is he capitalizing this, or why does he do it in this way? There's always a reason, and that sort of systematicness, I think, lends itself to philosophical analysis in a way that you can find ethical themes in other literature or something. But I think partly what's allowed this collaboration to work so well is the content we've picked, but also even from early on, John's dissertation was on Nietzsche and Deleuze and these sorts of themes of affirmation in modernist literature. So we always had a lot of overlap philosophically. And so that hasn't been, I do think there's moments when we're writing where our training comes out and one of us sort of takes over a little bit and is like, hey, but there's this tradition that does X. We should link this up or something. But overall, it's been really organic.
Yeah.
It worked really well.
Well, you said that McCarthy's a philosophical writer. You also mentioned that there are themes that you're exploring. I want to return to some of those themes a little later, but maybe you could say a little bit about that. You see McCarthy as a philosopher in his own right. I think you wrote about this. So it's not just that you're picking at his work to pull out some themes, but you see him as a philosopher. Could you expand on that just a little bit?
I think so we wrote a piece in the spring where so it just happens. There's been a series of books on McCarthy as a philosopher, but what those books tend to do, and they're really excellent. There's a lot of like interesting analysis in there. But what we found that a lot of them do is that what they find in McCarthy is that McCarthy is sort of he's representative of some philosophical theme. So he's got a metaphysics kind of like Plato, or he has an ethics sort of like Hannah Arendt, or something like that kind of comparative. Here's this idea that's in a philosopher that McCarthy also seems to espouse in some way. But from doing that entire lit review, we came to the idea of the real provocation of reading McCarthy as a philosopher would be, what if you didn't go that route, but you actually read him as a philosopher in his own right? So it's not that he's like some other figure in his metaphysics or ethics or politics, but he's trying to develop his own philosophical system. And so the book, one of the ideas that got us really excited about the possibility of a book, that what if you just analyzed all of McCarthy's work in a systematic way as a philosopher without appealing to his similarity to some existing philosophical system? And so what would that look like? And it works with someone like McCarthy because he's so philosophically systematic, I think. And we'd already done quite a bit of work by that point, and we'd seen continuous themes over his work, and so it seemed a natural next step.
Right. Is this unusual in this type of scholarship to view an author like McCarthy as a philosopher? It seems like a slightly different take on what we normally see when people are working with popular culture.
I mean, I don't know if I'd say it's completely unusual. It's definitely more common to do the kind of analysis Rick was just talking about, where people will go into authors or literary figures or literary texts and find resonance with various philosophical and other kinds of writers too. But it's quite common, this sort of ex-author and ex-philosopher. So I don't know, James Joyce and Descartes or something. And this is a much more common kind of move than what we're talking about. But I think some of it is really, and this is a great thing for the humanities, the kind of territorialness of the fields is beginning to break down in the last couple of decades.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a way in which that, in terms of just practical professional things like getting published and this is newly more possible than it would have been when we had more traditional kind of demarcations between the various disciplines.
That's right too.
Yeah, so McCarthy, I mean, he does have the attention of the Academy now, and scholars are writing about his work, but he's also a popular writer, so in some ways he's representative of American popular culture, a particular type of it. Some of his books are made into movies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there something about popular culture or something about fiction and narratives, particularly McCarthy's work, that lends itself to the communication of religious and philosophical ideas in a way maybe that traditional philosophical discourse does not?
I mean, I think so. In some of this analysis there's a long tradition in McCarthy scholarship of pointing to McCarthy's language as being really essential to, and if you've ever read any McCarthy, right, I mean, he has a very distinctive style, and it comes out of a kind of Faulknerian tradition, and I mean, it is, some of his novels are so Baroque and so, symbolic and allegorical and just layered on top of layer on top of layer, and so, I think there's been a long tradition of saying whatever it is that McCarthy's up to, his language is sort of fundamental to that project. But what we found is that I think people have struggled to give accounts of that over his entire corpus. So I think there is something about literature that opens up philosophical possibilities that you don't have when you're approaching it in a more kind of traditional philosophical argumentative style or something like that. But what's interesting about McCarthy is, I think, at least this is our position, I think McCarthy is actually making concerted philosophical arguments and consistent ones across his work. And this is where you find these passages in books that are just like long sort of like narration of people like laying out dense philosophical ideas. And so, but I do think there's something about the literary style of it that is unique, and opens up possibilities that you don't have in other forms of philosophy.
Well, I also just think that fiction and media in general is, and again, this is kind of a disciplinary thing, it's just by definition a little bit more accessible. And I think that some snobbery about popular culture in the Academy is thankfully beginning to fall away. Right. And we're beginning to allow things like mass market films to still be serious. And in many cases, the film industry and the pulp publishing industry has really responded. I mean, there's some brilliant films being made right now. And there's brilliant books that are also selling millions of copies being put out, fiction being put out right now. Yeah. And McCarthy, I think, by historical accident or whatever, kind of landed at just the right time, where things like All the Pretty Horses, which was one of the first ones that was made into a really successful movie, and certainly The Road, you know, we got Viggo Mortensen starring in The Road. I mean, you know, like, we actually have literary works where we're drawing those sort of A-list stars and the kind of big budgets that didn't used to happen.
Right. Yeah. So I've read some of McCarthy's work. I'm a fan, and I've also read some criticism of McCarthy's work, and he's described as, in some places, as a nihilist, as an existentialist, a Buddhist, a Christian, a Gnostic, a mystic. Do you guys care to label him, or what do you? How can one person fit all those labels and categories?
Well, maybe I'll start this and you can finish it.
Sounds great.
There's a little bit of a lineage to some of that list that you worked out. I mean, certainly earlier in his career, when the Academy first began taking notice of him in the 80s, and I'm thinking in particular of the book called The Achievements of Cormac McCarthy by Vereen Bell, that was when that nihilist, really pessimistic stuff was big, and that was the main read of him, that he was this dark, nihilistic, pessimistic writer. Mm-hmm. And I think we've evolved from that as a field, and not that book still gets cited routinely, and I think, you know, it's still really an important text, but that particular reading of him has kind of fallen away and made room for some of these other themes that you mentioned, the mystic and the Gnostic being in particular. And Diane Luce deserves a lot of credit for that Gnostic theme.
Absolutely.
Her work has, for decades, really explored that and pushed it.
And Edwin Arnold, who taught here at App State for
Yes,
many
he
years.
did, yeah.
Was a giant McCarthy scholar.
Yeah, and collaborated with Luce.
Yeah.
So you mentioned The Road, and that might have been the first novel you wrote about together, or
No
or
Country
one of-
for Old Men and then
okay.
The Road. Yeah.
The Road. So The Road is sort of apocalyptic work, I guess, or post-apocalyptic. I don't know how you would categorize it as a genre. It's dark in places, or it's dark all the way through, I guess.
It's dark all through.
So, but yet, when you write about it, you say that it can be read as certainly there's some Christian themes here, but some people like to read it as Christian allegory. How does that work? You know, I don't know that that's the predominant reading of it, but I'm just curious because I would not have read it that way, or I have not read it that way. How might one read this very dark, apocalyptic tale of father and son as Christian allegory?
I think so. There are religious themes throughout McCarthy, and you know, it's very hard. Take a text like The Road, it's very hard to have, you know, so it's clearly allegorical. The father and son don't have names. They're kind of every person figures, right? They're carrying the fire. It's a, you know, a story about sort of the power. I mean, you could read it in some ways as a story about the power of the love of a father for a son. There's certain kinds of already now kind of building a kind of Christian resonance there, I think. And then this kind of there's a lot of scenes in the book that lend themselves to, I think, a certain kind of redemptive, Christ-like figure in the son, and so you can sort of see where that is. And then, you know, the father dies, and he's dead for 3 days. The son waits for 3 days. It's kind of hard not to hear in that a certain kind of Christian motif. So I think, and then the end of the book is, you know, it's dark all the way through, but the end of the book has been, you know, sort of lots of folks have pointed to how, you know, in the end, the boy is saved by this family. Like the chances of this in this world seem almost impossible, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and I mean, you know, one of the things to think about is that, you know, this is a world where there's no other animals, seemingly no food, et cetera, and this family that saves them has a dog. So it's like this is supposed to signal to us that they're not cannibals, that they have enough support to support an animal that's not human, right? There's all these sorts of like real. I mean, it's the best possible outcome.
Right.
So I think it's hard not to read that in terms of salvation. And so I don't think as Christian allegory has been the predominant reading, but it's very hard to not deal with The Road. It's very hard to see The Road as ultimately a narrative that's just nihilistic. And clearly I mean, there have been a few people who tried to read it that way. we find those readings pretty uncompelling, right? But you can, you know, all through McCarthy's work, you have that kind of Christian allegory and symbolism. And this is where it's not just Christian, because there's plenty of Gnostic themes. The kind of God that McCarthy seems to articulate in lots of his fiction, it's all over the place, doesn't seem to be a traditional Christian God in all places, one you could pray to, for instance, or something like that. Right. But you could definitely read The Road in that way, and I think the redemption at the end is the really key, and the figure of the son is the really key elements of that.
Yeah. Well, I do think, I mean, you know, we're talking about words like salvation, words like redemption, and these are obviously words with profound Christian denotations and connotations. But I mean, they're also bigger than that too. I mean, there's kinds of salvations that aren't necessarily, strictly Christian or in Christian allegories. There's kinds of redemption that aren't necessarily Christian allegory. So there's definitely a space for that in the book. I mean, in the 3 days, McCarthy's too careful. I mean, he meant us to think that.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the father at one point says something about the child being the sort of vessel of all things that are good that he carries with him. I mean, we have a kind of grail imagery there that certainly it works.
Eli says you're on the road, that he says that something like you're on the road with the last God, and they meet up. The only named figure in the book's Eli, right? Like, and Eli's like, it would be terrifying to be on the road with the last God. So I mean, there's lots of things. When you start dissecting it, you can find lots of Christian themes, I think, or themes that are very hard to not read as Christian themes.
Yeah, so but predominantly the theme of redemption and the theme of the Son being the bearer of compassion and grace and these sorts of things. Yeah, so I see that. You also mentioned that there is this, in McCarthy's corpus, in his literature as a whole, the divine appears or is there, but certainly not in a traditional way. How does the divine kind of infuse itself into McCarthy's stories? How do we recognize the supernatural or the divine?
This has been a big debate in the literature, So
Well, it still is.
Yeah, still, and for us, this is one of the most exciting things. Is that I think McCarthy scholarship is at a real crossroads, and it's part of what we're working on an edited collection right now to sort of provoke people to think about, what's the next step in McCarthy scholarship and reading McCarthy in this kind of positive sense of finding some sort of what's the positive project in McCarthy's work? Because I don't think it's all darkness and nihilism.
And we're not the only ones making those kinds of noises. I mean, the field is coming in that direction as a whole.
But I think on the sort of religious themes in particular, the predominant readings coming out of like the 1990s was an emphasis on grace and hope, and that this is why the Gnostic reading, I think, was so powerful for lots of folks, is that there is a kind of mystery, and a kind of mystery that seems more primordial, maybe, than a kind of traditional Christian figure of God. And that also there's a kind of, like, McCarthy seems really interested in the kind of spiritual essence of the human and the loss, conceivably, or the possibility of losing that kind of spiritual essence, whatever that would be associated with. So there's lots of work. Petra Mundik wrote I think the most definitive book on this kind of reading that kind of mystical tradition or kind of first philosophical tradition in McCarthy's work, and I find that compelling in lots of ways. The limit to it, I think, is that it kind of downplays the social critique element of McCarthy. That there's so much kind of McCarthy's critique of modern industrial society, McCarthy's critique of capitalism, McCarthy's sort of like worry about the environmental degradation and these sorts of questions that don't. So it's compelling, but it also seems to kind of pick certain elements of McCarthy out and explain some of them much better than others. And that's part of what we're interested in is, could you give an account of the whole? Which is why reading him as a philosopher rather than sort of reading him as a representative as a system. Like, what if he has a kind of mystical element, and that's part of his philosophical system? So he's not a Gnostic, he's not a mystic, he's not a Christian. What then is he when he's trying to develop this conception of redemption or grace?
But this is where he's also certainly not a nihilist. I mean, there are metaphysical dimensions to what McCarthy's trying to do, and there are even, if I can use his word, spiritual conditions to what he's trying to do, and he thinks that kind of level of purpose and meaning to human life really matters and needs to be carefully articulated and explored.
Yeah, and you don't need organized religion for that necessarily.
Yeah.
Is that something that comes out in The Road more clearly, or is it everywhere? I mean, I focused on The Road here, but it's kind of first and foremost in my mind. But you see it across all of his fiction.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, there's an evolution, and of course, everyone points to what generally is called the Tennessee or the Appalachian period, and then his move west, and so people have already seen an evolution in McCarthy in various ways. But I mean, I think from the Orchard Keeper to The Road,
And I think for us, that focus is, I think McCarthy, and you see this in the Orchard Keeper. This was a piece we did that argues that I mean, he's always concerned with the kind of. I think McCarthy, or one of McCarthy's fundamental questions, is about what is life, and can life live under modern social conditions? Is life still alive? Is life still vibrant? Right? And I think he has a really pessimistic read of whether that's the case. But then I think this kind of notion that this kind of emphasis on redemption, spirituality, mysticism, etc., is all geared in terms of a kind of critique of modern community and society, and trying to, and we think, this is at least the argument, that he's articulating another vision of life, another vision of sociality. And I think The Road is doing this, but it's across all his fiction.
Let's move to that point, because you mentioned sometimes the critique of the social situation gets lost in some of these other discussions. I thought your article on The Road really did a brilliant job of bringing that social critique to the forefront through an analysis of this relationship between the father and the son. The father represents a kind of radical individualism that's part of the American mythos. The son represents life and community. You're going to articulate better than I am, but that, it seems to me, is that's what you're suggesting is happening when you say the old way is gone, right, in this book, and it has to pass away if there's going to be hope for a continuance of society and human nature. Is that the kind of critique there that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's certainly a wonderful
absolutely.
example of that.
Yeah.
And I think that it's such a good example because, unlike a certain kind of American mythos, this is not, a Oedipal or any other kind of rival between a father and a son. I mean, these are two individuals who care deeply about one another, and yet the son is going to leave the teachings of the father there at the end of the book really very directly and objectively. And again, Rick said early in this, there's no accidents in McCarthy, and especially when he's that precise about this. And where, the father tells him throughout the whole book, and especially on his deathbed, here are the things that you need not to do. You don't take any risks. Don't ever give up the gun, right? You essentially can't go out and find other people because it's too risky. And of course, after his 3-day vigil with his father's body, the son violates every one of those
Almost
immediately.
immediately, right? I mean, it's so quick. Like and I think the most telling one is not just taking the risk, but then he offers the other figure his gun, and he even says to him, how do I know you're one of the good guys? And the guy says, you don't know, you're just going to take a shot. And so it's articulated very explicitly, but I think this is also where the allegorical character of The Road, we do this reading of trying to think about, it's an allegory, but the father represents a certain person. The father is presumably white, the father is, American. This takes, it is an allegory, but it's also, he's middle class, he's probably well educated, just by indications in the book. And so then you can develop out of that. And we weren't the first people to sort of point to some of these elements, but then if you develop that into, he represents the world that has passed away, and the son represents the world that could still be possible. And I think for us, that world is defined as a communal world, yes, but also a world that's, all through the book, all he wants to do is share moments with other humans. And when you ask, in the name of what, there's no in the name of what. It's that desire to, let's share a meal together, let's share food together, let's help each other out. And I think this, there's something really powerful in that idea that just what if the world as this kind of individualistic, consumer-driven society, which McCarthy has critiqued a lot, that world has passed away, and in The Road, as bleak as it is, the possibility for human life comes back to something very simple and very communal. And I think that's the thing that I think drove you can see the positive project. It's not fully fleshed out, but the son clearly represents real ideals you can talk about. And this tendency in McCarthy scholarship to say if there's a positive project, you can't really articulate. It's like a negative theology. You can't articulate what it is, only what it's not, right. Or it's sort of mystical. That's true to some degree, but there's really concrete things you can say about what McCarthy's vision of community and a different world would be. At least that's our hope.
So when the son, and you used the word hope, when the son kind of gives himself over to this group at the end, there's another quality, right? Trust.
Yeah,
that needs to be part of this new vision of humanity. So
Absolutely.
you're talking about trust and hope and compassion and community. And these are religious values, not just Christian values, but in some ways universal religious values.
Yeah.
So when you say that the world of the Father is the world that's passed away, there's no going back to that world after this apocalyptic disaster. Is that our world? Is that what it represents? Is that the allegory that's where we are right now? This is what we have to lose?
I want to be careful, but I think the answer is yes, but there's a big caveat with that. These are difficult days, and there's a risk, and we both also work in the environmental humanities, and of course, post-apocalyptic fiction and media is big right now. And there's a danger in this of just sort of doom staring, where we're just everything is lost and there isn't any kind of hope. And there's a kind of fetishistic fascination with the end of the world and the disaster. And you read some of this climate fiction or some of these speculative fiction or watch some of these films, and it really is a kind of just staring into how bad it could actually get. And I think that's not what McCarthy's doing. And I think we need to be careful to actually, as a society, to get too wrapped up in how bad things actually are. So, go ahead.
And I also think one of the things that we're interested in, and some other people have pointed this, is I think, is that where we are? And then one of our questions is, and this is open, I think an open question in McCarthy, is who's the we? And I do think this is where let's not over romanticize what McCarthy also, like themes in McCarthy. I mean, McCarthy is often critiqued for being pretty masculinist. He doesn't have that many female characters. He's very with some exceptions, very Eurocentric, very white his characters are. His protagonists are often really manly in a traditional sense, although that gets critiqued and there's lots of good work on that. So I do think there's also a kind of who's the we whose world has passed away. I do think, yes, a world has passed away and it's a consumer-driven, capitalist, first world American sort of world. But then that opens up questions about, how to read what McCarthy is specifically critiquing. And then I think this also leads us back to, like, these kinds of questions that are really important lead us back to, if we're going to articulate a different vision, to what degree does McCarthy allow us to do that, given that, some of these limitations potentially of his work. And so we're really interested in that element too.
Yeah. So I get that this kind of apocalyptic genre is quite popular now, and I like the way that you have dealt with it in this essay by pointing out that I think one of the things in some of the recent apocalyptic stuff is that somehow we can avoid the end, or we can stop it from happening, and we can return to the way things were, but not in your essay. The apocalypse is the apocalypse. It's the end, and if something else is going to continue, it's got to be something of a radically different nature. And when I read that, I thought about the book of Revelation with the old heaven and the old earth passing away, and a new heaven and a new earth coming into being. But I comment just a little bit on that kind of irrevocable nature of the apocalypse.
I mean, it's clear in the book. I mean, McCarthy has this beautiful scene where the father looks out over a river and speaks to his own father, who he tries to call earlier. He picks up a phone, dials his parents' house, and then, of course, there's no one to call. But he has this moment where, from the beginning of the book, they're kind of past the point of no return, and that image and that sort of language comes back. So it's clear that's McCarthy's vision, which is part of where we take it from. But I think it's kind of fairly clear that we're not going to we can reform, and is a good thing, and it's probably good to alleviate suffering and to ameliorate it as much as we can. But like the kinds of changes we're going to have to make are going to be ones that will look from our perspective now like a totally different world. And if there's the possibility of seeing in McCarthy something useful for us thinking that's part of our interest, we're gonna have to follow out that kind of impulse in his work, I think. And this is one of our questions, how robust is that impulse? We're not quite sure yet, but I think it's there, and I think that's one of the most interesting things McCarthy's fiction could offer our thinking for this moment.
And one of the most important, timely moments right now. Because, well, on the one hand, I said a moment ago that we don't want to spend too much time staring into the void and just fascinating on the disaster. On the other hand, we cannot, as you just said, pretend like we can go back to some kind of business as usual and return to anything like what the 20th century has purported to offer.
Well, I can't believe our time has come to an end. I had so many other questions I wanted to ask you. I just would reiterate that I think your work is important. It's important work on an important author. I look forward to the book when it comes out, and I appreciate you, John, coming up from Savannah State to be with us today, and appreciate both of you and the work you do. And thanks for coming to chat with us today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Now I'm going to go home and reread The Road, I think.
Oh,
you have to be in the right mood to do that, right?
That's true. I don't know if the end of the term is the right time to do it.
Okay, I'll wait.
Maybe wait a minute.
Okay. Well, that's it for this episode of Religion and Life. I hope you'll join us again next time when my guest will be Chris Bartell. a philosopher at Appalachian State University, who will be talking about ethical dimensions of video gaming. Until then, this is Ozzy Ostwald.